I'm not surprised. I mean, the Ecolite will give you, it looks more at bone quality, and the DEXA is bone quantity. So I think it's important for people to realize that the bone density test only looks at the mineral part of bone. But bone is a tissue, and all tissues are made up of different things. If your bone was just minerals, it would be brittle like a column of chalk and just disintegrate. But the other part of bone, or major component of bone that's important, is the proteins in bone, the collagen in bone, the extracellular matrix. In addition to collagen, there are 180 to 200 different proteins in bone. And so the bone density test measures the quantity of bone, but not the quality of bone. The Ecolite is also looking at bone quality, and it's that collagen and extracellular matrix that gives bone its quality and ultimate strength.
Hey there, are you over 40 and finding that a good night's sleep feels like a distant dream? Have no fear, I have cracked the code. I am offering a free ebook, A Woman's Guide to Kick-Ass Sleep, with insights tailored just for you. So, if you're ready to dive into the secrets of sound sleep after 40 and wake up refreshed, zip over to sleep.hormoneshelp.com and snag that ebook. Your dreamy sleep awaits. Dr. Neustadt, everybody that listens to Menopause Mastery knows that I have a special heart for osteoporosis. And so I'm very excited to have you here today and talk about bone health, osteoporosis, strong bones, and how to avoid fracture. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. Please call me John.
Definitely. I will definitely. So tell me, how did you get into osteoporosis and bone health?
When I started on this, almost 20 years ago now, I never saw myself specializing in this area. But one of the founders of my medical school, Dr. Bill Mitchell, in an advanced therapeutics class that we all had to take in our fourth year, wisely said to us, your patients will tell you what they need. And if you listen well enough, you'll hear them. And then it's your responsibility to go find out if you don't know. And I had patients coming into my practice as I was a young, new, scrappy doc, trying to help them as best I could. And I started having women come in with osteoporosis, and I was doing what I was taught to do. And it was working in the sense that their bone density test was going up. I was working with them with, nutritionally, with diet and dietary supplements and exercise, and talking to them about, possible medications they could use. And my mother-in-law, who's now 93, almost 94, she had osteoporosis at the time, and I was helping her a little bit in that same way. And she was seeing her medical doctor, who had her on Fosamax. And then she tripped on a throw rug in her house and broke her hip. And I was shocked, and she was surprised. And her doctor was surprised, because by the objective measure of that bone density test result, which was going up, she should have been protected. Her doctor was happy with the results. She was happy with the results. I was happy with the results. And then she breaks a hip. So I thought to myself, something's wrong with this picture. I started digging into the research. I started looking at what the studies actually showed, and was shocked to learn how limited that bone density test result actually is, that the clinical usefulness of it is much more narrow than how it's used in practice. We've known since the 1990s, or it's been in the medical research since the 1990s, that a bone density test predicts less than half of people with osteoporosis who are fractured. And then in 2008, an Archives of Internal Medicine article came out that quantified that even better, that showed that in women with osteoporosis, a bone density test only predicts 44% of them who will break a bone. And in men, it's only 21%. So that bone density test result, which is almost exclusively what's treated, they want to see that number on that test go up, is missing the larger picture. Every medical association and organization that has looked at the data has correctly concluded that fracture risk depends on factors largely other than bone density. And yet the conventional approach, and even many integrative docs are sure about this, that it's almost exclusively focused on changing that number on the test instead of treating the patient sitting in front of them. Because if you have osteoporosis and you break a bone, That is the most dangerous thing with this disease. If you're a woman with osteoporosis and you fracture a hip, there's up to a 36% chance that you're going to be dead within a year. And if you survive, about half of those don't ever regain their full pre-fracture level of mobility or pain-free life that they had. And in fact, people are shocked to learn if you're a woman 45 years old or older, your risk for an osteoporosis fracture is equal to your combined risk of breast, uterine, and ovarian cancer. And yet there is no, big awareness campaign, PR campaign nationally for this. So it's flying under the radar and it's being undertreated and frankly, mistreated.
No, I would agree. I'm always shocked by, in our clinic, how many women come through in their middle 50s and onward that haven't even had a DEXA, despite the fact that it is fraught with opportunity for improvement, let's call it that. Nobody's even screening at all to find out somebody's at risk, and especially that high-risk population who's petite, small, slight of build, which are going to have, greater likelihood. But it's surprising that we don't have better measures, that we don't have better ways, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other ones. I would still say there's a lot lacking here.
Well, and in terms of screening, even in eligible patients, over 90% of patients aren't getting screened even when they're eligible for it. And the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommendations for osteoporosis screening don't even recommend screening in that age population that you mentioned, the 50-year-old women. They are looking at screening for women who are 65 years or older or postmenopausal women who are younger. There's a little bit of a caveat in there that expands it, meaning or women who are at risk for osteoporosis. And men, they don't even recommend until I think maybe 70. Now, there are other organizations like the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation, on which I'm on the corporate advisory roundtable for that association. They have more nuanced recommendations, meaning anybody 50 years old or older who breaks a bone, they should be screened for osteoporosis because oftentimes that is the first sign. That's the only thing that happens before somebody is diagnosed as they break a bone. And so there's a lot of reasons for screening much earlier. Perimenopausal, I think, is a great time. Get a baseline as you're starting to enter perimenopause to see where your bone density is, because through perimenopause and for the 10 years after is the fastest rate of bone loss. Despite that limitation of the bone density test that I mentioned, I do believe it's important. It's one piece of a much larger puzzle, but it should not be overemphasized, and it definitely should not be the only thing that's addressed or treated or discussed.
We do it on baseline on pretty much any female patient. So even if they're 30, because you look at it, you go, okay, so our estimated peak bone mass is by 30 years old. Basically, you're downhill at that point. 30, 35, 40, you're already on your downhill trajectory, and it'd be a whole lot easier to catch somebody in an early stage than to wait until it becomes pronounced, because even at 50, a lot of times there is significant loss already, and it's so much harder to gain back. I look at it as it's such an obvious sort of paradigm of what's wrong with medicine today. It's wait until it's a problem, then go search for it. It's like, okay, it's very frustrating.
Well, and I think that's a great thing to offer to your patients as long as the tests are being interpreted properly. So one of the challenges with clinicians out there, and I'm not saying this is in your clinic, but in general, is there's a study confirming this, that once they get the test results, they're not really sure what they're looking at. So there are two major test results on that. It's reported as a T-score and a Z-score. So for the age population that you mentioned, the 30-year-old, the T-score is not applicable. There's no reference range for that young for a T-score. A T-score measures somebody's bone mineral density compared to somebody of the same sex. So for example, if you're a woman, 55-year-old woman, and you get a bone density test, your T-score is going to compare your bone density to the bone density of a woman in her between 20 and 29 years old. So in her 20s of the same ethnicity, right? But below 50, that T-score, there's no reference range. The T-score is not applicable. So then you have the Z-score. A Z-score compares your bone density to somebody of your own age. And so that can be used at younger populations, or it can also be used, and is really important, and this is where there's a lot of subtlety in the interpretation that's missed. A Z-score can be an indication of bone loss from other causes, not menopause. It can be an indication of, for example, medication-induced bone loss, which is a huge concern for me, given the large number of prescriptions and medications that people are on. Some of the most commonly prescribed medications destroy bone and increase fracture risk. And so we're starting to see bone being damaged and fracture risk increasing in much younger populations than we used to, because they're on proton pump inhibitors, they're on other medications long-term that are causing these problems, and doctors aren't even aware that they're creating osteoporosis.
Yeah, frequent use of steroids, they're given out so freely, not realizing that they could be causing so much potential risk for bone loss. So let's talk, since we started talking about DEXA, let's talk a little bit about some of the newer technology, because some people may have it available to them. We talked a little bit earlier before we got on about some of those technologies. Let's talk a little bit about TBS. How do you feel about TBS, the trabecular bone score on a DEXA?
I think it is okay. I think that a trabecular bone score, can give you some indication of bone quality. I think that, again, these things need to be validated, and they need to be validated against fracture risk. So far, when you look at the different technologies out there, whether it's a DEXA, whether it's a MRI, whether it's a CT scan, whether it's ultrasound, there's only one technology so far that actually has been shown to be superior to a bone density scan in terms of predicting fractures. And there's only one study showing that. And that's you and I talked about it, that the Ecolite, abdominal ultrasound. And so in that sense, giving that fracture score, it holds promise. It's not covered by insurance yet. But again, it's a test. And I think there are limitations to all tests. And it shouldn't be the only thing that's looked at, evaluated, or treated.
Like I was talking earlier with John, and I had an Ecolite. We have a DEXA in our office, and I had mine done in December. And it was interesting to be able to see that, because again, a DEXA is very superficial, and my DEXA looks better than my Echo, which is interesting.
I'm not surprised. I mean, the Ecolite will give you, it looks more at bone quality, and the DEXA is bone quantity. So I think it's important for people to realize that the bone density test only looks at the mineral part of bone. But bone is a tissue, and all tissues are made up of different things. If your bone was just minerals, it would be brittle like a column of chalk and just disintegrate. But the other part of bone, or major component of bone that's important, is the proteins in bone, the collagen in bone, the extracellular matrix. In addition to collagen, there are 180 to 200 different proteins in bone. And so the bone density test measures the quantity of bone, but not the quality of bone. The Ecolite is also looking at bone quality. And it's that collagen and extracellular matrix that gives bone its quality and ultimate strength.
Yeah. For me, it was a wake-up call. We didn't have a chance to talk about this, but the reason why I do a lot with osteoporosis is I got what I thought was a baseline in my mid-30s. Being proactive, I go get a baseline against my Z-score, and I was a power lifter. Now, and I'm talking very heavy. And I had osteopenia in my left femur and hip. And I have a colitis history, colitis and celiac. So, but I thought I had skirted that. And I've since been able to improve the DEXA. But when I had the Echo, that was the first time that I was like, okay, there's still improvements here that probably need to be made, because I now have enough data point, right? And that's why I think these kind of tests, even though they're not hugely validated, are at least another data point.
Well, and you mentioned comorbidities, other conditions, colitis. There's a long list of conditions that cause what's called secondary osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is not caused by the loss of estrogen and menopause. And any chronic inflammatory disease, autoimmune diseases, they increase the risk for osteoporosis and damage bone. But there are many other diseases and conditions that do the same thing. So being a power lifter is, could be great, depending on other aspects of your health and status. Women who are athletes could struggle with what's called the female athlete triad. So you could be in, seemingly amazing shape as a power lifter, but if there's disordered eating, if you're amenorrhea, if you don't have your period anymore, those then are risk factors for osteoporosis, despite the fact that you may be lifting a tremendous amount of weight. So it doesn't come back similar to the bone density test or any one test, one specific variable. This is a chronic disease, a chronic condition. And all chronic conditions have multiple variables that impact your health status and how well your body can build bone. We can build bone all throughout life. I mean, you can build it back. It's just a matter of having the right approach, working with somebody like you, somebody who understands the complexities of nuances of bone from an integrated perspective instead of just throwing drugs at the problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know in your book, which we're going to talk about too, you have an entire chapter on the medications. And I'm curious, obviously, as a prescriber, there are probably times that you think the medications are absolutely, something to be considered. Where is your stance on those meds today? How do you feel about them?
I feel that medications, when prescribed properly, are excellent. The problem is they're not being prescribed well, and they're being overprescribed. I like to teach people the most important and fundamental question when it comes to osteoporosis and bone health. If you're being recommended anything, it doesn't matter if it's a medication, a dietary supplement, a diet. The question that should be asked is, has this been shown in clinical trials? Or if they're not clinical trials, epidemiological research, has it been shown in the research to reduce fractures in somebody with my diagnosis? And that's important because it's really not about focusing on changing that number on the test, a bone density test or an Ecolite or whatever the test was. It's about clinically the most dangerous thing, fractures. Has it been shown to reduce your fractures? So when you look at the medications, the first line medications still are the oral bisphosphonates, like Fosamax, Actonel. And what the research shows that they are effective for what's called the primary prevention of fracture. So primary fracture prevention means you have not had a previous fracture with osteoporosis. We're trying to prevent you from having your first one. And then secondary fracture prevention means if you've had a fracture before, we're trying to prevent subsequent fractures from happening. So for primary fracture prevention, which most people that I see, they're in that category. They haven't had an osteoporosis fracture yet. We're trying to help them not get one. All the medications except one have only been shown to prevent primary vertebral fractures. So only fractures of the spine. They don't prevent hip fractures. And people are confused by that because they think, well, God, a bone, bone is a bone. If it prevents one, doesn't it prevent others? And no, that's not the case because of different vectors of force and movements in the body, how you move and stand and get up. That's just not how it works. But again, most clinicians, they don't know that. They just think, it's approved by the FDA for osteoporosis. It improves the bone density test and it'll help prevent fractures. But the only one that's been shown to prevent both vertebral and hip fractures, if you haven't had one before, is intravenous Zometa. So if somebody decides to go on medication, that's a good choice for them. In my opinion, that's the best medication to do if they can go on one. For secondary fracture prevention, there are a lot more choices. All the medications then are more effective at reducing fractures at both sites, vertebral and hip fractures. And by the way, hip fracture is the most dangerous type of fracture. So why you'd only want to prevent fractures of the spine and not the hip also is, it's a mystery to me. But there are great choices when it comes to medications. And if somebody has had a fracture before, and if they have other risk factors, then I'm definitely talking to them more about considering a medication and what the benefits and risks are. There are always risks and benefit conversations that need to happen around medications. And sometimes they're appropriate and sometimes the medication's not appropriate.
Right. No, I agree. I think it's very shocking to me how many people have come in, particularly in the last few years, having been told they're, just over the line on osteoporosis and that they're automatically given a drug. Here's your drug. You have to go on this. You're going to fracture and die. It's pretty much how the message gets played out. And it's like, okay, that's pretty aggressive, particularly because it's oral bisphosphonates, which don't have a good track record at all.
Well, and most people quit them, but the majority of people stop after 1 and even more people after 2 years because of the side effects. They don't continue them. But here's part of I think it's important for people to understand. Recommendations from physicians aren't always based on the data. So first of all, they may or may not understand the data well. But even if they do, there are legal ramifications for not recommending what is standard of care. So if they don't tell you to go on a drug and you actually do fracture and you go back and you say, you didn't give me a drug and I broke a bone, well, they could be sued, despite the fact that the research doesn't even support the benefit of it. So that is a consideration, especially if they're in a more corporate medical setting, like a corporate clinic, a hospital-based thing, that sort of thing. It's a lot more driven by protocols than by individualized medicine tailored to the patient.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand that. I'm like, they have to follow the cookbook. They at least need to tell you about it. So let's switch gears a little bit. So, let's talk a little bit about supplementation, because I know you made your own products. We were talking earlier and you're like, I wasn't even planning on becoming a supplement company. So obviously osteoporosis is a big part of that. So tell me, what do you think are the most important nutrients for someone to build better bone strength? Obviously understanding that the diet, you have to dial in the diet first. You can't, supplement past a bad diet. But what ones do you think they have to consider?
So I always go back to, and I help people understand, no matter what, I said it before, what is the most important question to ask if you're being recommended something? So I'll ask you, what's the most important question to ask?
Yeah.
Hasn't been shown to reduce fractures in clinical trials. And if they don't have that data, at the very least, hasn't been shown to improve bone density. Like, if that's the closest we've got. There are only 4 nutrients that have been shown in clinical trials to improve bone density and reduce fractures. Despite the fact you look out there at these bone health products, and by the way, none of them are approved by the FDA to diagnose, treat, prevent, or cure any disease, including osteoporosis. They're not treatments for osteoporosis. Let me be very clear about that. They're not intended to replace a medication. But there are 4 nutrients, only 4 that have been shown to reduce fractures in clinical trials. And what that means is that they're effective at maintaining bone strength. Now, you see magnesium, you see zinc, you see many other nutrients in supplements, boron. Those are not on that short list. So the nutrients that have been shown to improve bone density and maintain strong bones are calcium and vitamin D, a specific form of vitamin K2 called MK4, and strontium, the mineral strontium, which I am not a fan of strontium. I'm happy to tell you why. I do not like strontium. So calcium and vitamin D, everybody's heard of calcium and vitamin D. I'm a big fan of testing vitamin D levels. The research shows that there's an association with the best fracture reduction, hip fracture reduction, when it's between 30 and 44, approximately nanograms per milliliter. And for immune health, a lot of doctors, myself included, functional medicine practitioners like that number even higher, 60, 70, around there. But getting it at least to that, 30 to 44 range is important. For calcium, most people are getting in dietary supplements, I think, too much. They're megadosing with calcium. So the research shows that calcium and vitamin D, when combined, can reduce fractures by about 18 to 22%, which is okay, but we can do better. The average American woman gets 800 milligrams of calcium in her diet. A diet should always be first. If you can get it through diet, fantastic. Most people aren't getting the full 1,200 milligrams through diet, but they don't need 1,000 milligrams, most people, as a dietary supplement, and a lot of doctors are recommending that still. It can be dangerous getting too much calcium. The current position statement of the American College of Preventive Cardiology and the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation is that people should not get more than the tolerable upper limit of 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams of calcium per day from all sources. And that's, I think, important also to understand, is that the recommended daily allowance for a nutrient is from all sources, diet and dietary supplements. So the average American woman's getting about 800 milligrams a day. The recommended target amount is 1,200 milligrams a day of calcium. And there's no benefit from getting any more than 1,200 milligrams when it comes to bone health. Then if you're eating about an average diet, then supplementing with maybe 400 milligrams of calcium is enough, right? And if you're getting enough, then you don't need to supplement at all. And if for some reason you're not getting enough, then you can supplement with more. But it's that customized, individualized approach that I think is very important. There's not a one size fits all. When it comes to vitamin K2, there are different forms of vitamin K2 on the market. Vitamin K is a category of nutrients. Vitamin K1 is found in green leafy vegetables. Vitamin K2 is another subcategory. Within that, there are different types of vitamin K2 that are designated by numbers. MK4 and MK7 are the ones you typically are going to find in dietary supplements. And we know in biochemistry, and I know you love biochemistry just like I do, that if you change one carbon atom, you get different biochemical activities in the body. Now, like a Venn diagram, there's overlapping activities, but there's different activities as well. And that's what we see with MK4 and MK7. So of those two nutrients, only MK4 has been shown to improve bone density and maintain strong bones, as shown by fewer fractures in clinical trials. In fact, more than 70% fewer fractures in clinical trials. It's been approved by the Ministry of Health in Japan for bone health since 1990, I believe it was 1996. MK7, in contrast, has never been shown to improve bone density. It only slows down how fast somebody loses bone mineral density. And in fact, in one clinical trial, they actually had faster bone loss when they took the MK7 compared to the people who didn't. And it's never been shown any outcomes, any data that's never been shown to maintain strong bones. No fracture data on MK7 showing that it actually helps reduce fractures. So for that reason, when I was looking, this is 17, 18 years ago, working with these patients in my clinic, looking at the research to find out about MK4, there's no product on the market that had the clinical trial dose of MK4 in it, the 45 milligrams per day, which you cannot get that from diet. And so I went ahead and I created this solution called Osteo-K. It was the first product in the Osteo-K line I created in 2007, MK4 with vitamin D and calcium. And since then, I've created other versions with just different amounts of calcium in it. So Osteo-K Minis has 400 milligrams of calcium per day with the 45 milligrams of MK4 and 2,000 IUs of vitamin D3. And then a new product, Osteo-MK4, with calcium-free version for those who don't need the calcium. So convinced by that research that not only do we guarantee, and also 17 years of working with this product and millions of capsules sold, that we guarantee that it'll stabilize or improve somebody's bone density within 6 months. But more importantly, it'll maintain strong bones, meaning if you break a bone while taking the product, we will refund your money for all those bottles purchased between your bone density scans for all qualifying purchases. And not only that, MK4 has other activities in the body too that MK7 has never been shown to have. They're up to phase 2 clinical trials on MK4 for people with acute myeloid leukemia, myeloid dysplastic syndrome, hepatocellular carcinoma, and one case report of acute promyelocytic leukemia showing that it promotes healthy cell division, it promotes healthy blood production, and it is helpful in these patients.
Oh, wow. I did not know that information. That's awesome.
And it's non-toxic.
Right. And then it also has great cardiovascular support at the same time.
Correct. Now, the cardiovascular research on vitamin K2, in my opinion, is a bit preliminary. It's still ongoing. And there's not really, you see people out there on the internet making all sorts of claims. You won't see any cardiovascular claims on my website because I think it's too early in the research to be conclusive. And in fact, the research has shown contradictory results, meaning that it doesn't actually decalcify arteries, and it may not change calcium score in the arteries, but it may improve blood flow regardless of that. And it may only be in people who have pre-existing atherosclerosis versus those who don't.
Study I looked at was, I think, pre-existing atherosclerosis. Like I believe the most favorable one was pre-existing.
Right. So I think we know that through diet and lifestyle, we can reverse atherosclerosis.
Right.
That's proven. And so I'd rather work with people on that. For me, false hope based on research that doesn't even show it. And people this is my pet peeve about the internet. Look, I really hope, if nothing else, besides just some tidbits about osteoporosis and bone health that people get today, that they learn to be savvier consumers and more cautious consumers when it comes to the internet and dietary supplements. I really counsel people and educate people to look for citations. No matter if any claim is made, people will come to me and say, well, I read this claim, magnesium and calcium have to be together in a dietary supplement, or you can't absorb the calcium, or it doesn't work. And for 17 years, I've been looking at the research. I found no supporting data for that. And I keep saying, well, did they give you a citation for that? Can you send me the citation from the website? Zero. There is no evidence for that. And in fact, in the clinical trials that used MK4 that showed the improvement of bone density and that showed that it maintained strong bones by reducing fractures in the volunteers, they didn't use magnesium at all. It was MK4 with vitamin D or MK4 with vitamin D and calcium. That was it.
Yeah, I agree. I think everybody wants to have a magic pill. They're like, I'm looking for the magic pill. And I was like, believe me, if Dr. Neustadt had one, if I had one, we would be selling it. If there was a magic pill, we would probably provide it to everybody and we wouldn't have to talk about it. That's not true. We have to have the diet first. It's got to be dialed in for sure.
Absolutely. And with respect to diet first, you're so right, because even when people seem to be doing everything right, meaning they're taking the right supplements, they're taking one of my Osteo-K products, and they're exercising and they're eating a Mediterranean dietary pattern, like a Mediterranean style diet, that's been shown to be associated with 20% reduction in osteoporosis and a 21% reduction in hip fractures. Even when they're doing all of that right, that there may be some fine tuning with the diet that can make all the difference. So I've seen cases where they're doing all of that right and their bone density is not moving. And then I ask them, how much protein are you eating? I do a diet recall with them. And invariably, they're not getting enough protein. Protein seems to be a major missing component in almost everybody I talk to. As we get older, the USRDA for protein is insufficient to maintain muscle mass and bone health. And so I recommend people get above the USRDA based on published research. And in fact, the amount of protein somebody consumes can account for 2 to 4% or 2 to 3% of somebody's bone mineral density alone. So I recommend, if we're looking at pounds, 0.6 grams of protein per pound of body weight per day. So you just take your body weight and multiply it by 0.6. That's the minimum you should be getting. If you have a hard time getting that from diet, then supplement with a protein powder or collagen powder, something to supplement your amino acids with.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that's just across the board, even if osteoporosis isn't the primary conversation, particularly in women. A lot of times I hear the story, they're just like, I don't want to cook anymore. I don't want to deal with it. I'm like, doesn't matter. You're going to have to get the protein in. We got to make sure we're not losing muscle mass, because muscle mass, I would say, is equally, if not more important than the bone density itself. Sarcopenia is a huge problem along with it.
Well, 95% of fractures occur because somebody falls. So anything we can do to reduce the risk for falls is necessarily going to reduce fractures and other fall-related injuries. And since you mentioned sarcopenia, an even more dangerous situation than sarcopenia in terms of bone health is osteosarcopenia. If you have that combination of osteoporosis plus sarcopenia, you're at a higher risk of dying from a fracture than if you just had sarcopenia alone.
Yeah. Let's talk about what osteosarcopenia is, just in case my listeners don't know. How would you define it for them? Because I think they don't, because the American population in particular cares about being thin. They don't think about the composition of the person.
I'm sure that our definitions of osteosarcopenia would be exactly the same. Osteosarcopenia is a combination of muscle loss or muscle wasting plus osteoporosis.
Yeah, so under lean. So anybody, if your skeletal muscle is under what should be for your height to weight ratio, you are running the risk of at least sarcopenia at a minimum. And particularly we see that in like assisted living center. My mom had a stroke and heart attack last year, subsequently fell and broke her pelvis. She fell like 7 times before she finally did it. But, and because she's in a wheelchair now, she definitely has some sarcopenia and osteoporosis along with it. Makes the fracture risk go through the roof.
That's correct. Absolutely. And, disuse after a stroke is another risk, definitely causes muscle loss. There's a lot. Parkinson's disease, dementia, stroke, disuse after a stroke. There's a lot, irritable bowel syndrome, irritable bowel disease. There's a long list of diseases and situations that people get, and many of them they get as they get older, that increase the risk for osteoporosis fractures and dying. In fact, interestingly, the risk of dying from an osteoporosis fracture is almost double in a man than what it is in a woman. Currently, the thinking is about 80% of osteoporosis cases are in women and 20% are in men. But if you're a man and you fracture a hip, your risk for dying is almost double what it is in a woman. And the thinking and the research and kind of the conversations that I've been privy to on that is The consensus seems to be that it may be due to the fact that as men and women get older, the comorbidities in men, the other diseases that we may get, are more severe than in women. So heart disease, diabetes tend to be more severe in men. And just like with COVID, people with more severe and more comorbidities, other diseases, when they got COVID, they were at a higher risk for dying. Similarly, it looks like it's the same situation from an osteoporosis fracture.
Oh, interesting. So I have another question professionally. Did you notice, post-pandemic, a significant uptick in basically DEXA scores that got significantly poorer during that pandemic time period? Let's say it was a woman in early 2020 has a DEXA and it's here, and then it's 2023 and they get their DEXA again 2 years later, or 2022, let's say, and all of a sudden they've had a significant loss. I've just seen a lot of people that have like this big loss in that time period. I have my own theory as to how that is occurring, but have you seen professionally?
Gosh, that is a great question. I don't have the answer to that. I haven't done probably enough of those tests, and I haven't looked and crunched the data to know, but that is a fascinating, I'd love to know the answer to that.
I've committed to looking at it, but I haven't actually sat and I've gone through the rigors of running the data. But it is interesting because I think it was just the combination of sedentary life, gyms are closed, everything about our world changed so dramatically.
Chronic stress.
And I was like, they did a study, I can't remember, I should have pulled it before we talked, about just having a knee replacement, that week of immobility compared to where you were, the amount of muscle mass that someone would lose. If you just think about something that might set somebody back for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, just to be slightly more sedentary. And I think as a whole, we saw a big change, particularly in that very petite Caucasian and East Asian background, women who probably didn't have great, bone density to start with. I just see a major acceleration in that time period.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised. That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that before, but I think you're probably right.
Yeah. I think it's truly probably just, the shutting down of the world for that long, definitely at play. So if you were to say, what's the other major thing, if you were to leave kind of a parting idea for, everybody listening to the podcast, what's the other thing that you really want to hit home if they're worried about osteoporosis and fracture risk, which I have a very large population that are, what would you like them to know?
That's a great question. I think that what I want them to know is partly what I already said. And that is a bone density test only predicts 44% of women with osteoporosis and only 21% of men. So please don't focus just on that. In fact, I spend my typical conversation with a patient, the very first few minutes of it is about putting that test in its proper context and lowering the temperature, because people come, they're so stressed and worried and anxious. They're scared. And rightly so in a way, because the diagnosis of osteoporosis is serious and it is a scary diagnosis. But what they've typically been told is, you have osteoporosis, your bone density is low, you better go on this medication or you're going to fracture and you're going to die. And so rightly so. They're overwhelmed and totally freaked out. And so I like to just calm things down and say, okay, this is actually what the bone density test result tells you. This is actually how helpful it is and what the limits of it are. So let's take a deep breath. Let's put it in its context. This is an important diagnosis. It is serious, but it is not an emergency. There is time for you to educate yourself, to learn what it is that you can do, and to put together a bone health program that is specific to your needs and that will help you strengthen your bones and reduce your fracture risk. And that's exactly why I wrote my book, Fracture Proof Your Bones. It walks people through chapter by chapter. What does the data show? And what can you do to create your own bone health program, as well as what questions can you ask of your doctor? But what can you do to create your bone health program that makes sense for you?
Yeah, I think that's important. Everybody needs to get that book. Every woman, every man, even if you don't think it'll happen to you, it's somebody in your life it has a high potential to happen to, And I think we need to just do everything we can to help somebody avoid fractures, because, if you look at what leading cause of injury, leading cause of death, accidental death, is definitely fractures.
So every 30 seconds, somewhere, someone in the world is breaking a bone, fracturing with osteoporosis. Globally, it's second only to cardiovascular disease as a health issue. I'm sure you've heard it. I've heard the stories of my mother, my grandmother, somebody I know, they broke their hip or they fell and fractured and they had osteoporosis. And that was the sort of the beginning of the end, this kind of downward spiral that happens where there's chronic pain, there's disability, and the remaining time that they have here on earth is fraught with discomfort and pain and depression, inability to enjoy the time they have left. And I don't want that to be anybody. I want people to be healthy and strong and vital until, at least that's what I hope for me, one day I just am done.
Yeah, I agree with you. What is it my husband says? One day you just wake up dead. So tell me, Steve, that everybody can get your book, and it's called Fracture Proof Your Bones, and we can get it on Amazon, correct? And your website as well?
Yeah, you can get on my website, nbihealth.com, nbihealth.com, and on Amazon as well.
Fantastic. So everybody go out and get that book so you know exactly what to do for your bones. And Dr. Neustadt, thank you for joining me on Menopause Mastery.
Great talking with you.
Great talking with you. And thank you, everybody, for listening to Menopause Mastery. I'll be back with you next week.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.